Hey everyone, welcome back to another deep dive. If you're enjoying our historical journeys, do us a favor and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and click that bell icon for notifications. Today, we're diving deep into British India. Buckle up, especially if you're a UPSC aspirant wrestling with GS1 Modern Indian History, because this one's for you.
Oh, absolutely. We're going to explore the administration, the economy, and even the social fabric of India under the British Raj. It's a complex story with echoes that reach into India today.
So imagine India in the 18th century. It's vibrant, it's diverse, a major player on the world stage, really.
Yeah, a real powerhouse.
And then, bam, the British East India Company arrives on the scene. Things are about to change, like drastically.
For sure, and not always for the better, but that's why we're here to break it all down, right?
Exactly. So let's start with British administration. How did a company focused on trade morph into this, mega ruling force?
Well, it was a gradual process, kind of a creeping takeover, if you will. They started with trading posts, but their ambitions grew.
Yeah, and with every step, they needed more control.
Exactly. So they created this intricate administrative machine. Think of it like a system with all these interlocking parts.
Okay, I'm picturing it. What were the key components of this system?
Well, you had a structured civil service, for starters, then a military presence to back it up, police forces for law and order, and of course, a whole new legal system based on, get this, English common law.
Wow, so they basically built a whole new government on top of the existing structures.
Yeah, pretty much. And the whole point was control over resources, over trade, and ultimately over the people of India.
Okay, makes sense. So let's zoom in on the civil service, the heart of any administration. How did that evolve under the British?
So initially it was just a small setup, catering to the company's business needs.
I bet Indians weren't exactly welcomed with open arms.
Yeah, you got it. They were largely excluded from any real positions of power. It was all about British dominance, fueled by this inherent belief in their own superiority.
So even when they introduced reforms, like Cornwallis's anti-corruption measures, it was more about tightening their grip, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
They wanted a professional, efficient service, but the top jobs, reserved for Europeans, of course.
It's like they wanted the benefits of a strong system without sharing the power.
You got it. Then came the Charter Acts in 1793 and 1833. Now, these acts technically opened the door for Indians to join the civil service.
Oh, so a step in the right direction.
On paper, maybe, but the reality was they weren't really implemented effectively. It was more like lip service to the idea of equality. And even when they formalized the Indian civil service in 1861, they made sure the entrance exam was in English.
A convenient way to keep most Indians out.
Yeah, you could say that. Fluent English became a prerequisite for even aspiring to these positions. Later, there were some efforts to address this imbalance. The Aitchison Committee in 1886, then the Montfort Reforms in 1919, they pushed for more Indian involvement.
So some progress, at least.
Well, kind of, but European dominance persisted. Even with the Government of India Act of 1935, which did expand Indian participation, Europeans still held on to the key positions.
It seems like a recurring theme. Reforms introduced, but control retained. Okay, so we've talked about the administrators, the brains of the operation. What about the enforcers? How did the British establish their police system in India?
Initially, they just relied on the local zamindars, the landlords, to keep things in check.
That doesn't sound very efficient.
It wasn't. So good old Cornwallis, the reformer, stepped in again. He established a formal police force in 1791. Police stations were set up all over, and they appointed these darogas as officers in charge.
A more structured approach then. But was it really about serving the people or more about, maintaining British control?
Ah, good question. While it did help curb some crime, it definitely also became a tool to suppress any dissent or opposition to their rule.
A dual purpose then.
Yeah.
Keep the peace, but also squash any challenges to their authority.
Exactly. They wanted order, but on their terms.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, let's talk about the muscle behind British rule, the military.
Yes. The backbone of their power. Before the 1857 uprising, you see, they had separate forces. The Queen's Army, which was for British troops, and then the Company's Army, which had both European and Indian regiments.
But there was still a clear divide, right?
Oh, absolutely. Especially after the 1857 uprising, that shook them to their core, So they reorganized the army to make sure something like that never happened again. They increased the ratio of European to Indian troops, which obviously reinforced their dominance.
A very strategic move.
And then they introduced this controversial martial and non-martial race theory.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. But
Uh,
it sounds pretty messed up. What was it based on?
It was all rooted in these racist beliefs about certain communities being, naturally more warlike and loyal, like the Sikhs, Gurkhas, and Pathans.
So they used that to divide the Indian ranks and further solidify their own control.
Precisely. And they went even further, isolating Indian soldiers from any nationalist influences. They banned newspapers, journals, anything that might stir up trouble.
A very calculated approach to maintaining their grip.
Yeah,
So they used force, but also manipulation and these divisive tactics.
absolutely. It was a multi-pronged strategy.
Okay, fascinating. Now let's shift gears to the judiciary. How did the British establish their legal system in India, and how did that impact, the existing legal structures?
Well, the shift started with these mayor's courts back in 1726. This was the beginning of the common law system being imposed in India, gradually replacing the existing Mughal legal system.
Okay, so a pretty major overhaul of the legal system.
Yeah, definitely. As the East India Company transitioned from just a trading company to, a full-blown ruling power, they needed a legal framework that suited their interests.
A legal system that solidified their authority. So what were some of the key changes they implemented?
Well, Warren Hastings, when he was the Governor General, he introduced a bunch of reforms. He set up these district fauzdari adalats for criminal cases, and then district diwani adalats for civil matters. Plus, appellate courts, like the Sadar Diwani Adalat and the Sadar Nizamat Adalat. The thing is, these courts, they used Mughal law and Hindu law, respectively.
So they tried to incorporate some of the existing legal traditions.
Yeah, to some extent. It was like they were trying to weave their system into the existing fabric, if that makes sense. And then in 1773, they established the Supreme Court in Calcutta.
Okay, so we're starting to see this hierarchical court structure emerge.
Exactly. And then comes Cornwallis, Mr. Reformer himself. He focused on separating the revenue powers from the judiciary, and he set up these circuit courts, with European judges, of course, to handle appeals.
Always with the European judges.
Well, they didn't exactly trust the Indians to uphold their laws, did they?
I guess not.
Anyway, Cornwallis, he introduced this Cornwallis Code, which really emphasized the rule of law and made officials accountable to civil courts. He wanted a system that, at least on paper, looked fair and accountable, but, the reality was often quite different. These courts were expensive, complex, and pretty easy to manipulate, especially if you were, on the right side of the power structure.
Now, I can imagine language played a big role in excluding many Indians from accessing justice, right?
Oh, absolutely. The use of English in the courts was a huge barrier. But there were some attempts to address this. Under William Bentinck, they allowed the use of vernacular languages in the courts. It was a challenge to the, dominance of Persian.
So steps towards greater accessibility.
Yeah, you could say that. And another big development was the Law Commission, established in 1833 under Macaulay. Their job was to, codify the laws, and that eventually led to the Civil Procedure Code of 1859, the Indian Penal Code of 1860, and the Criminal Procedure Code of 1861.
Wow, those are pretty foundational legal documents.
They are. And those codes, while obviously reflecting British legal principles, they actually formed the foundation of the modern Indian legal system today. It's kind of a mixed legacy, I guess you could say.
A complex legacy, for sure. So this new system, did it really deliver justice for ordinary Indians?
It's a tough question. I mean, the British did bring the idea of the rule of law to India, right? They codified the laws, which replaced the often arbitrary and regionally different interpretations of religious laws. It created a more standardized system, at least in theory. And for the first time, European officials themselves were subject to these courts, making them accountable for their actions.
So a shift from the days of absolute power? But I bet there were downsides too.
Well, for sure. For many Indians, this new legal system remained out of reach. The courts were overloaded, and European judges, who often didn't understand Indian customs, made judgments that, didn't always make sense in the local context.
So while the system aimed for fairness and uniformity, in practice, it often fell short.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
Okay, so we've talked about the centralized structures of power. The administration, the police, the military, the judiciary. But did the British ever try to decentralize power through, local governance?
They did, actually, though maybe not always for the purest of reasons. They introduced municipalities and district boards with the the stated goal of making administration more efficient at the local level. They also wanted to improve local services.
Okay, and what motivated them to take this seemingly progressive step?
Well, it was partly pragmatism. Decentralization could reduce the burden on the central administration, right?
Oh.
Plus, it could make British rule more, palatable to the Indians by giving them a sense of ownership.
A clever way to maintain control while seeming to relinquish it.
You got it.
Yeah.
So you had Mayo's resolution in 1870, which allowed provincial governments to levy local taxes, which gave these local bodies some financial independence.
Okay, so a step in the right direction. What else?
Then Ripon's resolution in 1882, which actually advocated for a non-official majority in local bodies. So more Indian involvement in decision-making, at least theoretically.
So were these genuine steps towards local self-governance?
Well, the reality was these bodies often lacked the resources and the real autonomy to actually govern effectively. They had the responsibility, but not the power. The Royal Commission on Decentralization in 1908 recommended giving them more financial muscle, but implementation was, slow and often inadequate. And even the introduction of diarchy under the 1919 Government of India Act, which, made local self-government a transferred subject, still kept finances as a reserved subject.
So control over the purse strings remained firmly in British hands.
Exactly. And even the Government of India Act of 1935, while it did give provinces more autonomy and led to new local self-government acts, it still didn't fully address the issue of financial constraints.
It seems like they wanted to appear to be promoting local self-governance without actually giving up control.
Yeah, that's a fair way to put it. They wanted to have their cake and eat it too, so to speak.
That's a perfect way to put it. So we've seen how the British established their administrative and legal systems in India. But what about their economic policies and their impact? That's where we'll see some of the most, dramatic and lasting effects of British rule.
Absolutely. And that's what we'll explore in our next segment.
All right, so we've delved into how the British established their administrative and legal systems in India. Now let's turn our attention to the economic sphere, shall we? This is where we see some of the most, I guess you could say, long-lasting and dramatic effects of British rule.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, unlike previous rulers who were mostly focused on, political and military control, the British came with a very clear economic agenda. They wanted to tap into India's vast resources for their own gain.
So basically, they wanted to transform India into this colonial economy, right? Serving British interests above all else. It's a stark contrast to India's economic position before they arrived.
Absolutely. Think about it. In the 18th century, India was a global economic powerhouse. Like, seriously, accounting for almost a quarter of the world's economy.
Wow, 23%, that's massive.
It is, right. But then, by the time India gained independence in 1947, its share had dropped to a measly 3%.
A staggering decline. And that's directly because of British policies.
Without a doubt. Their policies systematically drained India's wealth and crippled its economy.
Okay, let's break it down. How exactly did British policies lead to such a drastic decline?
Well, it all started with trade. The Charter Act of 1813 basically opened the floodgates, right? Allowing British goods to pour into Indian markets.
Okay, so Indian markets were flooded with British products.
Yeah.
What kind of products are we talking about?
Oh, all sorts. But mainly manufactured goods, textiles, things like that, produced cheaply in British factories. They undercut local industries and artisans who just couldn't compete with the prices or the sheer volume of goods coming in.
So Indian industries were basically being crushed under the weight of these cheap imports.
Yeah, pretty much. And on top of that, Indian products themselves faced all these tariffs and barriers in European markets. It was this one-sided free trade system, totally rigged in favor of the British.
So they could sell their goods freely in India, but Indian goods were shut out of British markets. That's just blatantly unfair.
Exactly. It was all about protecting British industries at the expense of Indian ones.
And this had a devastating impact on specific Indian industries. Right?
Oh, absolutely. Take the textile industry, for example. India was world-renowned for its high-quality textiles, but British policies basically dismantled this once thriving sector.
So Indians were forced to buy expensive British textiles while their own products couldn't find a market.
Yeah, it was a deliberate strategy to stifle Indian competition, and this pattern was repeated across numerous industries.
It's just blatant economic manipulation, really. But what about industrial development within India itself? I mean, the Industrial Revolution was happening in Britain at this time, right? Didn't that have any positive spillover effects for India?
Well, it's a common misconception that British industrialization somehow benefited India. The reality is, British policies actually hindered industrial growth in India. They wanted India to be a source of raw materials and a captive market for their manufactured goods, not a competitor.
So instead of like fostering industrial growth in India, they actually suppressed it.
Yeah, pretty much. Let's take shipbuilding, for example. India had this long, proud history of shipbuilding, right? With these amazing centers in Surat, Malabar, Bengal, and Masulipatam. But British policies like monopolies and heavy duties on Indian vessels totally decimated the industry.
And this pattern was repeated in other sectors as well.
Oh, for sure. Take the steel industry, for instance. India had a history of producing high-quality steel, but British restrictions on standards and imports choked its growth. The result, modern industry in India emerged really late and on a very limited scale, mostly controlled by, foreign entities, mainly these British managing agencies.
And what about Indian-owned industries? Did they face specific challenges?
They faced a whole bunch of obstacles. Like, they were constantly struggling with financial constraints, a lack of tariff protection, and just this constant unfair competition from foreign companies. Often, the colonial government itself actually opposed the growth of Indian industries, viewing them as a threat to their economic dominance.
So even when Indians tried to establish their own industries, the system was rigged against them.
Exactly. It was designed to keep Indian industries subservient to British interests. And even when they introduced factory acts like those in 1881 and 1891 to regulate working conditions, their primary aim was to protect British industrialists, not Indian workers.
It seems like their priorities were always clear: protect British interests at all costs. Yeah. All right, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about transportation and communication. The British invested quite a bit in developing infrastructure, particularly railways in India. What was their motivation behind that?
Well, it wasn't exactly altruism. The development of railways in India was primarily driven by, British economic and political interests. It made it easier to transport raw materials from the interior to the ports for export back to Britain. Plus, it enabled the movement of British goods throughout India and helped them deploy troops quickly to maintain control.
So it was all about consolidating their grip on India.
You got it. But there's an interesting twist to this story.
I'm all ears. What is it?
While the railways were built to serve British interests, they kind of inadvertently fueled the rise of Indian nationalism. By connecting different parts of India, right, the railways allowed people to travel more easily, exchange ideas, and see firsthand, the realities of British rule across the country.
So it backfired on them in a way.
In a sense, yes. It was one of those unintended consequences.
That's fascinating. So a tool meant for control ended up contributing to their eventual downfall.
Exactly. It's quite ironic when you think about it. What about other forms of communication, like the postal and telegraph systems?
Yeah. Were those developed with Indian interests in mind as well?
Not really. They did offer some benefits to Indians for sure, but access was limited and expensive. These systems were primarily designed to serve, British administrative and commercial needs.
So once again, it's about reinforcing their control, this time over communication.
Precisely. Information is power, right? And they wanted to keep that power firmly in their grasp.
Makes sense. Okay, let's move on to agriculture now. This was, and still is, the backbone of the Indian economy. How did British policies impact this crucial sector?
Well, their policies had a pretty profound and often devastating impact on millions of farmers. Their focus on maximizing land revenue led to the implementation of all these different land settlement systems, each with its own little quirks, but all designed to streamline revenue collection and assert greater control over land ownership.
So systems like the permanent settlement, Maholwari settlement, and Rayatwari settlement. I've heard those terms before. But what were the key differences between them, and how did they affect the farmers who actually worked the land?
All right, so under the permanent settlement, which they introduced in Bengal and Bihar, they made the zamindars, the landlords, permanent owners of the land. They were responsible for paying a fixed revenue to the British.
Okay, so the zamindars benefited from this system. But what about the cultivators, the actual farmers?
Well, it created this whole new class of landowners who often had a lot of power over the cultivators. And that often led to exploitation and, the rise of absentee landlordism.
So a system that seemed to benefit the zamindars, but potentially at the expense of the people actually working the land.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Then you had the Maholwari system, which they implemented in parts of North and Central India. In this system, they settled the revenue with either the village headman or a group of landlords who were jointly responsible for payment.
So a slightly different approach, but did it lead to better outcomes for the cultivators?
Not really. I mean, it did acknowledge the rights of cultivators to some extent, but it still led to exploitation, particularly when revenue demands were high.
And what about the riot-worry system?
Ah, yes. This one was mostly prevalent in South India. Under the Rayatwari system, they settled revenue directly with the individual cultivators, recognizing them as the landowners.
Okay, so that sounds more equitable, right? Recognizing the farmers as the actual owners of the land.
On the surface, maybe, but they had these periodic revisions of the revenue demand based on, fluctuating market rates and things like soil quality. And that often burdened the farmers with these really high revenue demands, pushing them to debt and making them vulnerable to exploitation by moneylenders.
So regardless of the system, it seems like the focus was always on squeezing as much revenue as possible out of the land, often at the expense of the farmers themselves.
You got it. And this, combined with other factors like, the lack of government investment in agriculture and the exploitative practices of the zamindars and moneylenders, led to widespread impoverishment among the peasantry.
It's a tragic consequence of prioritizing profit over the well-being of the people who actually work the land. A stark reminder of the human cost of this colonial exploitation.
Yeah.
But now, let's shift gears a little and explore how British rule impacted Indian society and culture. This is where we see I think, a really fascinating clash of civilizations, the imposition of new ideas, and the emergence of resistance movements.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important to remember that British policies in this area were often pretty contradictory, driven by, a mix of motivations. Sometimes they genuinely wanted to, reform Indian society, but other times it was just a calculated strategy to maintain control.
All right, welcome back to our deep dive into British India. We've covered how they set up their administration, the economic policies that really reshaped India, and now it's time to get into the really interesting stuff, society and culture. It's like this clash of civilizations, right, with new ideas being imposed and resistance movements emerging.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And you got to remember, British policies in this area were often all over the place. I mean, they had a mix of motivations. Sometimes it seemed like they genuinely wanted to reform Indian society, but other times it felt like it was just about control.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. What were some of the key elements of their, socio-religious policy? Did
Yeah.
they actively meddle in Indian religious and social customs?
It kind of evolved over time. Initially, they took this hands-off approach, mostly out of pragmatism, I think. They wanted to avoid unnecessary conflicts and just maintain stability, which was crucial for their trade, right?
Yeah, makes sense.
Mm.
Keep the peace and the profits flowing. So the Charter Act of 1813 reinforced this non-interference stance, right? I remember reading that it specifically prohibited them from meddling in the religious beliefs and practices of Indians.
Exactly. But of course, that didn't last forever. Things started to change.
So what caused the shift from non-interference to, actively trying to mold Indian society to fit their ideals?
Well, a few things happened. You had the rise of evangelical Christianity back in Britain, plus you had these social reform movements popping up within India itself, and there was this growing belief among the British in the superiority of their own values. All this pushed them towards a more, interventionist approach. They started seeing themselves as these, agents of change, bringing enlightenment to India.
Enlightenment. Sounds a bit condescending, doesn't it? Like they were the saviors of Indian society or something.
Yeah, definitely had that vibe. But it was part of their whole justification for being there, right? The white man's burden and all that. So they started supporting these social reform movements that aligned with their own values, trying to eradicate practices they considered uncivilized or backward.
So things like sati, child marriage, the treatment of widows, these all came under fire.
Exactly. And reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy and organizations like the Brahmo Samaj, who were pushing for social change, often got backing from the British.
It's interesting, though, how they selectively supported reforms that fit their agenda, right? What about in the religious sphere? How did they navigate that?
Well, one of the key strategies of British rule was this whole divide and rule policy. They deliberately stoked tensions between Hindus and Muslims, creating this sense of separatism, all to make it easier for them to stay in control.
A classic tactic. Pit your opponents against each other, and you come out on top. And this manipulation of religious sentiments had a lasting impact, right? I mean, we're still seeing the consequences of that today.
Oh, absolutely. It's one of the most tragic legacies of British rule.
Okay, so They played this divide and rule game. But what about the role of Christian missionaries during this period?
Missionaries were a big part of the whole picture. The British encouraged their activities, letting them spread Christianity and set up schools and stuff. This had a huge impact on, the spread of Western education. And yeah, there were definitely some conversions to Christianity.
So Christianity became another tool of cultural influence alongside their whole Anglicization policy. What exactly did that entail?
Well, Anglicization was basically this deliberate push to promote English language, literature, culture, all of it. They use education and administration as their tools. The idea was to create this class of Indians who were like Indian in appearance, but English in their thinking.
Wow, that's pretty ambitious, trying to reshape Indian society in their own image. So how did they go about doing that?
Education was the main tool. The Charter Act of 1813 allocated funds to promote education, laying the groundwork for the whole English education system.
Right. And then the Woods Dispatch of 1854 really solidified that shift, making English the primary language of instruction and recommending the establishment of universities and colleges for Western education.
Exactly. English became the language of power, opportunity, all of that, and the impact of that is still felt today.
Yeah, it definitely created a divide between this, like, westernized elite and the masses who stayed rooted in their traditional ways of life. It's a complex legacy.
It is. I mean, even well-intentioned policies can have unintended consequences, right?
Absolutely. So from administrative structures to economic exploitation and these attempts to reshape Indian society, British rule left behind this really profound and complex legacy.
It did, and understanding this legacy is so important, not just for historical knowledge, but for understanding, the challenges and complexities of modern India.
That's a great point. It's not just about the past, it's about how the past shapes the present. So for our listeners, especially those UPSC aspirants who are prepping for the GS1 Modern Indian History section, what are some key takeaways they should keep in mind about this period?
Well, remember that British rule was this period of massive transformation. They established new systems, exploited resources, and tried to remold Indian society. But this period also saw resistance movements and the emergence of a new Indian identity.
It's a fascinating and crucial period in Indian history. Understanding it is essential for anyone who wants to grasp the complexities of modern India. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into British India. We hope you found it insightful.
And remember, this is just the beginning of your exploration. Keep digging, keep questioning, and keep learning.
And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on future episodes. Until next time, keep seeking knowledge.